A character vector is the most general one. A numeric vector is a little bit more specific, and a logical vector is the most specific of these three. Just like the character vector hello world, which has a length of 1, like we talked about, because it's just one string, you've been working with numeric vectors too. For example, just like we use class to look at hello world, let's use class to look at the number 2. Here you can see that 2 is numeric. Let's look up the documentation for numeric, and we can learn a little bit about a numeric vector. Vectors can be any length. Remember that now we're working with vectors of length 1 for the most part. This is a vector of length 2, 1, 2. And you can learn about the length of a vector like this. Length vec, you can see that it is 2. And vectors, like you can see here in this argument, can be much longer. As long as all of the parts of the vector are of the same kind, so if you're working with all characters or all numbers or all logicals, it is a vector. Let's make a little bit longer vector in order to talk about numeric. We'll call it long vec, and we'll assign to it c, open parentheses, 0 to 100. C, open parentheses, is the code for you to make a vector. So we'll call the documentation on C. And we can see that we can combine values into a vector or list. A list is a little bit different, but for now, just focus on the vector. C, we can give it different arguments, and we can look at some examples of C. In this example, we're making a long vector, and we're calling this vector 0 to 100. So I run that code. Now I've got long vec. I can see long vec in my environment. Long vec has a bunch of numbers in it. What class is long vec? Long vec is an integer, which is a type of numeric. This can be a little bit confusing when you start to see different words like integer and numeric, but just for now, focus on the fact that we're dealing with numbers. And then we can do length, long vec, and we're working with 101 numbers, and that's because we started with 0. So now we've worked through two different kinds of vectors. In both, you can see vec, the first one we worked with, has the type of CHR, which is character, and it has 2 elements, 2 parts. They're both character strings. And now long vec, you can see it's of type integer or numeric. Integer and numeric are not exactly the same, but for now, you can think of them as being very similar because they're both dealing with numbers. And in this one, we're dealing with a bunch of numbers. The last kind of vector we'll talk about today is the logical vector. Logicals are very simply either true or false. These are our 2 logicals. So if I look up the documentation for logical, and run the code, you can see a logical vector. You can see true and false, and there are no examples for this one, but you can learn a little bit more about what a logical vector is by going down. And if we wanted to make a longer logical vector, I'll just call it vec logical and assign it C, making a vector, and then I'll put in true, true, false. And I run this code, and I can see that vec logical is a logical kind of vector, and it's got 3 values, true, true, false. If I call class on vec logical, I can see that I get logical back. Remember that a very important part of working with vectors is that everything inside a single vector has to be the same kind of thing. So here we have numbers inside this vector. We have character strings or words inside this vector, and we have logicals inside this vector. You might ask, what happens if we create a mixed vector with different types of things? And I'm going to assign this a vector, and I'll put in a word, hello, I'll put in a number, and I'll put in a logical. So here we have 3 different kinds of things that we just learned about. We have a word, a number 1, and a logical, which is true. Earlier I talked about there being more specific types and more general types. A character string is the most general. So the order is character, and then numeric or integer, these are numbers, and then the logical kind. Character is the most general, this is more specific, and logical is the most specific. You can think about this very simply by saying, can I put one of these elements in parentheses, for example? You can put true in parentheses and make it into a character string very easily. So if I did this, true, now this is not a logical anymore. You can see even the color is different. Because it's in parentheses, it's now a word. It's the word true. So we just made this into a character vector. We can do the same with 1. Now this 1 is no longer a number. Now it's as if you wrote it with pen and paper. Now it's similar to a word because it's in parentheses. This is how you can think about what's more general and what's more specific. But still, we still have a number, a logical, and 3 character strings in this. When I run this code, here I get mixed vector, and you can see that it's of the type character. So if I run class on mixed vector and run that code, you can see it brings back character. And in mixed vector, you can see everything has been put into quotations. Everything has been made more general. It's been changed because everything in a vector needs to be the same kind of thing. So if you try to put different kinds of things into a vector, each element will get changed into the more general version